The first sound was a yelp, sharp and quickly bitten off, followed by a choked sob that tore through the quiet morning like a paper cut, small but intensely painful. Sarah spun around from the kitchen counter, a half-peeled apple falling from her hand and thudding softly onto the linoleum. Leo. Her son Leo was sitting on the small bench by the back door, his face screwed up in a mask of agony, one hand clutching his left foot, the other braced against the wall as if to keep himself from collapsing. His orthopedic shoe, a sturdy custom-made high top designed to support his ankle and align his gait, lay beside him, and something dark and metallic glinted from within its depths. "Leo, honey, what is it? What's wrong?" Sarah rushed to his side, her heart instantly a frantic drum against her ribs. He was trying to be brave. She could see it in the way his small jaw was clenched, the tears spilling silently down his pale cheeks, but the pain was too much. He couldn't speak, just whimpered, rocking back and forth. She knelt, her eyes scanning him for injury, her mind conditioned by her work as a Juvenile Injury Prevention Officer, already cataloging possibilities. A fall, a twisted ankle. But he was just putting on his shoes, a daily ritual they performed together before he headed off to his special school program. Her gaze fell on the discarded shoe, then the one still on his right foot. He hadn't even gotten it on all the way. Gently, she reached for his left foot. He flinched violently. Okay, sweetie, Mommy's here. Let me see, just let me see." Her voice was calm, soothing, a stark contrast to the alarm bells clanging in her head. He hesitantly relaxed his grip. Small, angry red welts were already rising on the tender skin of his instep, a peculiar linear pattern. Confused, she reached for the shoe he'd dropped. As her fingers brushed the opening, something snapped. With a vicious little click, the metallic jaws missing her skin by a fraction of an inch. Sarah recoiled as if stung, a gasp escaping her. Inside, Leo's shoe, nestled deep within the toe, was a mousetrap. A classic spring-loaded snap trap, its copper-colored trigger gleaming malevolently. Her blood ran cold, then hot, with a sudden furious understanding. This was no accident. This was deliberate. Someone had put a mousetrap armed and ready inside her disabled son's orthopedic shoe. The question of who would do such a thing and why slammed into her with the force of a physical blow, but beneath the shock, a cold, hard anger was already beginning to crystallize. She looked at Leo's tear-streaked face, at the painful marks on his foot, and a resolve as strong as steel settled within her. She would find out who did this, and they would pay. Her first priority, however, was Leo. "Okay, buddy," she said, her voice miraculously even. "Let's get this other shoe off very, very carefully." She reached for his right shoe, her fingers probing the interior with extreme caution before even attempting to loosen the laces. Her breath caught. Another one, identical to the first. Anger, sharp and potent, surged through her, so intense it almost choked her. She carefully disarmed it, her hands trembling slightly, then slid the shoe off Leo's uninjured foot. 2 traps, one for each shoe. This was calculated. This was monstrous. She scooped Leo into her arms, his small body trembling against hers. "Shh, it's okay, Mommy's got you. We're going to the doctor right now to make sure your foot is okay." He buried his face in her neck, his sobs now unrestrained. The apple lay forgotten on the floor, a small mundane casualty in a morning that had suddenly turned nightmarish. As she carried him out to the car, her mind was already working, her professional instincts kicking in, alongside the primal rage of a mother protecting her child. She would need evidence. She would need to be meticulous. This wasn't just a cruel prank. This was an assault on a vulnerable child, her child. The emergency room was a blur of antiseptic smells and hushed efficiency. Dr. Ramirez, a kind older pediatrician who had seen Leo for various issues related to his cerebral palsy, examined his foot with gentle hands. The traps hadn't broken the skin, thankfully, but the bruising was significant, and the psychological impact on Leo was evident in his wide, fearful eyes and his refusal to let his foot be touched without flinching. Severe contusions. Dr. Ramirez said, her expression grim, as Sarah explained what had happened, carefully omitting her immediate furious suspicions about who might be responsible. Given Leo's existing sensitivities and the nature of his disability, this is particularly cruel. The pressure from those traps, even for a few seconds, could have caused more significant damage if his bone structure were more fragile in that area. She documented everything meticulously, her notes precise and clinical. I'll need to report this as a suspected case of intentional injury to a minor, Sarah. You know the protocol. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. I know, and I want it reported. As a Juvenile Injury Prevention Officer, she initiated such reports herself countless times. Being on the receiving end was a profoundly unsettling experience, yet it also solidified her resolve. The system she worked within would now work for her for Leo. Back home, Leo was subdued, curled up on the sofa, with his favorite plush wolf, his injured foot propped on a pillow. Sarah gave him some pain medication and sat beside him, stroking his hair until his breathing evened out in an uneasy sleep. Only then did she allow herself to confront the maelstrom of her own emotions. The image of those traps, the sound of their snap, Leo's cry of pain. It all replayed in her mind, each repetition fueling a cold, methodical anger. She went to the back door and picked up the orthopedic shoes. They were expensive, custom-fitted, a lifeline for Leo's mobility. Now they were instruments of torture, tainted by malice. She carefully placed them and the 2 mouse traps she had disarmed into large evidence bags she kept in her work kit at home. She photographed Leo's injuries, the shoes, the traps, the location where he'd been sitting. Her training took over, providing a framework for her fury, channeling it into a purposeful investigation. Their neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates, was an enclave of well-maintained lawns and freshly painted houses, the kind of place where people paid significant HOA dues for the privilege of perceived order and tranquility. Sarah had moved here after her divorce, hoping for a safe, supportive community for Leo. For the most part, it had been. Neighbors were friendly, if sometimes a little distant. But there was one discordant note in the suburban symphony. Karen Kessler, the HOA president. Karen was a woman who seemed to thrive on a diet of minor infractions and perceived slights. She patrolled the neighborhood in her golf cart, her eyes hawk-like, searching for violations, a garbage can left out too long, a patch of lawn slightly overgrown, a child's bicycle abandoned on a driveway. Her pronouncements, delivered with a saccharine smile that never quite reached her cold, assessing eyes, were legendary. Sarah had mostly managed to avoid direct conflict, keeping her property immaculate, Leo's necessary medical equipment, his walker, his occasional wheelchair for longer distances, stored neatly in the garage. But there had been incidents, subtle comments, lingering stares at Leo's leg braces when he was younger, or the way he sometimes stumbled. A general air of disapproval that Sarah had tried to ignore, attributing it to Karen's abrasive personality rather than specific malice towards Leo. Now she wasn't so sure. Who else could it be? A random, opportunistic act of cruelty. It seemed unlikely. The traps were placed in Leo's specific shoes inside their home, or at least on their doorstep, where he often left them briefly before coming in. It required access knowledge of their routine. No, this felt targeted, personal. Her mind flashed back to the HOA meeting a few months ago. Karen had introduced a new bylaw proposal regarding aesthetic harmony in the community, a vaguely worded document that seemed to target anything deemed out of place. During the discussion, Karen had made a pointed remark about cumbersome medical apparatuses being left in public view, her gaze flicking briefly toward Sarah. At the time, Sarah had felt a prickle of annoyance but dismissed it. Now the memory felt chilling. Leo had a small, brightly colored, therapeutic tricycle he sometimes rode on the sidewalk under her supervision. A few weeks ago, Karen had approached her, her voice dripping with false concern. "Sarah, dear," she'd begun, "I'm sure you understand, but some of the residents have expressed unease about that tricycle. It's rather large for the pathways, and, well, it's not quite in keeping with the neighborhood's general appearance. Perhaps Leo could use it in your backyard." Sarah had been polite but firm. "Karen, it's a therapeutic device, and he uses it under my direct supervision on public sidewalks, which he is entitled to do. It's important for his gross motor skill development." Karen's smile had tightened. "Of course, dear. Just a suggestion for community harmony." That had been the first real inkling of conflict, the first time Sarah felt Karen's disapproval might be specifically directed at Leo, or at least the visible manifestations of his disability. Now thinking about it, the timing felt significant. That was the inciting incident, the first move in Karen's campaign. After that, the petty complaints had started. A note about the unsightly ramp Sarah had installed by the front steps, even though it was HOA approved and architecturally blended. A complaint about the clatter of Leo's braces on the pavement when he walked to the community mailbox with her, a sound barely audible above the rustling leaves. Each complaint was couched in the language of HOA rules, but the undercurrent felt personal pointed. Sarah had meticulously documented each one, her responses, polite, factual, always referencing the relevant accessibility laws Karen seemed so keen to ignore or misinterpret. The rising action had been insidious. Karen hadn't shouted or overtly threatened. Instead, she'd created an atmosphere of subtle harassment. Other children in the neighborhood who used to wave at Leo started to seem hesitant, their parents pulling them away a little faster when Karen was nearby. Sarah suspected Karen was spreading her poison-making comments to other residents. Then a week before the mousetrap incident, Leo's specially adapted swing seat in their backyard, visible from Karen's property over the low fence, had been tampered with. One of the support chains had been partially unscrewed, not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough that it could have given way under his weight. Sarah had discovered it during her routine safety check of his equipment. She'd had no proof it was Karen, but the suspicion had been a cold knot in her stomach. That was the second major shocker, a direct attempt to cause harm, though thankfully thwarted. She had reinforced the chain and started to be even more vigilant. And now this, the mousetraps. This wasn't subtle. This was a vicious direct assault. Sarah took a deep breath. She needed more than suspicion. She needed undeniable proof. Her JIPO training emphasized evidence-based action, and she would apply that same rigor to protecting her own son. She remembered the small, almost invisible security camera she had installed a year ago, tucked into the eaves above her front porch, covering the entryway and a portion of the yard. She'd put it in after a spate of minor package thefts in the neighborhood. She reviewed the footage regularly, but mostly it captured mail carriers and squirrels. Had she been saving the footage from this morning, she usually let it overwrite after a week. With a surge of adrenaline, she went to her computer. The camera fed to a cloud storage, and yes, this morning's footage was still there. Her hands trembled as she queued it up. The timestamp showed 7:15 a.m., just after she and Leo had come back from their short morning walk, before he usually put on his school shoes. He always left his shoes by the back door, but occasionally, if they were muddy, he'd leave them on the porch mat to air out for a few minutes before bringing them in. She vaguely remembered him doing that this morning. It had rained lightly overnight. The footage was clear. There was their porch. At 7:18 a.m., a figure entered the frame, medium height, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and sunglasses, a light jacket. The figure moved quickly, almost furtively, towards the area where Leo often left his shoes. Sarah's heart pounded. The figure bent down out of sight of the camera for a few crucial seconds, then straightened up and walked briskly away. It was Karen. Sarah was sure of it. The walk, the set of the shoulders even obscured by the hat and glasses, it was unmistakably Karen Kessler. Sarah saved the clip, her mind racing. This was significant. It showed Karen at her porch near the time the traps must have been placed. It wasn't definitive proof of her putting the traps in the shoes, but it placed her at the scene acting suspiciously. It was the midpoint twist. She needed the piece of evidence that transformed her suspicion into near certainty. What next? She could go to the police now. She had the medical report, the traps, the footage, but Karen would deny it. She'd say she was dropping off an HOA notice or checking on a plant. Sarah needed something more direct, something irrefutable if possible. She thought about the traps themselves, standard Victor brand, common as dirt. But where had these specific traps come from? Karen wasn't the type to have mouse traps lying around her immaculate, sterile home unless she'd purchased them recently for a specific purpose. Sarah decided to do a little reconnaissance. That afternoon, while Leo was resting, and a kind neighbor, Mrs. Albright, from across the street sat with him, Sarah took a drive. She visited the local hardware stores, the garden centers, even the larger grocery stores that sold pest control items. At the third store, Henderson's Hardware, no relation to Karen, ironically she hit a potential lead. She described the traps to the elderly owner, Mr. Henderson. The Victor Easy Set Classic, he said. Sold a fair few last week, had a bit of a run on them. Lady came in, bought a pack of 4, said she had a little problem in her garden shed. Sarah's pulse quickened. Do you remember what she looked like? Mr. Henderson pursed his lips. Middle-aged blondish hair, always very particular. Wears those fancy tracksuits sometimes. Lives over in Willow Creek, I think. Karen Kessler, that's her name. Comes in for her organic slug pellets. Bingo. Sarah felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Karen had bought a pack of 4 traps. 2 were in Leo's shoes. Where were the other 2, perhaps still in Karen's possession? This was another strong circumstantial link. Sarah knew she had to be careful. A direct confrontation with Karen now might make her panic destroy any remaining evidence. Instead, Sarah decided to use Karen's own tactics against her, the HOA. There was a monthly HOA meeting scheduled for the following week. It was usually a tedious affair dominated by Karen's monologues about compliance and civic duty. This time, Sarah decided it would be different. She spent the next few days meticulously preparing. She compiled a file Dr. Ramirez's report, her own photographs of Leo's injuries, and the shoes a printed still from the security footage showing Karen on her porch, a sworn statement from Mr. Henderson about Karen purchasing the traps. She also did some research into local and state laws regarding assault, battery, child endangerment, and specific statutes related to causing injury to a disabled minor, noting the enhanced penalties. Her JIPO knowledge was invaluable here. She wasn't just a grieving mother, she was a professional building a case. She also spoke to Mrs. Albright, the kind neighbor who had watched Leo. Mrs. Albright was a quiet, observant woman who had lived in Willow Creek for 30 years. When Sarah, choosing her words, carefully asked if she'd noticed anything unusual around Karen Kessler's house or behavior recently, Mrs. Albright hesitated. "Well, dear," she said slowly, "Karen is Karen, always bustling, always noticing. But I did see her out very early the other morning, the morning little Leo got hurt. She was walking past your house and she seemed jumpy, kept looking around. I thought it was odd, and she was carrying a small paper bag like the kind from the hardware store." Another piece of the puzzle. Sarah thanked her resolve hardening. The night of the HOA meeting arrived. The community clubhouse was filled with the usual lukewarm coffee and the murmur of polite, slightly bored conversation. Karen Kessler stood at the podium resplendent in a sharply creased pantsuit, a sheaf of papers in her hand. She beamed at the assembled residents. "Welcome, everyone, to our monthly discussion on maintaining the beauty and integrity of Willow Creek Estates." She began, her voice smooth and confident. Sarah sat quietly in the second row, her evidence file clutched in her lap. Leo was at home with a trusted sitter. He was recovering physically, but the incident had left him more anxious, more withdrawn. The sight of Karen, so calm and self-assured, made Sarah's stomach clench. Karen droned on about lawn edging standards and the proper disposal of recycling. Then she paused, her gaze sweeping the room, and landed on Sarah. A small, almost predatory smile touched her lips. "And on a related note of community standards," Karen said, her voice acquiring a sharper edge, "we must also address the issue of appropriate play. While we all cherish our children, certain boisterous activities or the presence of unsightly equipment can detract from the peaceful enjoyment of our shared spaces. I trust we can all be more considerate." Her eyes met Sarah's, a clear, unmistakable challenge. This was it. Karen was trying to publicly shame her to use the platform to further her campaign of harassment. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. This was her opening. She waited for Karen to finish her sentence, then raised her hand calmly. "Karen, may I address that point?" Karen looked momentarily surprised, then waved a dismissive hand. "If you must be brief, Sarah, we have a lot to get through." Sarah stood up, her voice clear and steady, though her heart was hammering. "Actually, Karen, I wanted to talk about something far more serious than lawn edging or play equipment. I want to talk about child safety, specifically the safety of disabled children in our community." A hush fell over the room. Karen's smile faltered. "I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum," she began. "Oh, I think it is," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Because last Tuesday morning, my son Leo was the victim of a deliberate malicious act designed to cause him serious injury. Someone placed armed mousetraps inside his orthopedic shoes." Gasps rippled through the room. Faces turned towards Sarah, shocked, concerned. Karen's face had gone pale. "Mousetraps," Mr. Henderson from the hardware store exclaimed from the back. "Like the ones I sold you." "Karen." Karen shot him a venomous glare, then turned back to Sarah, attempting an expression of bewildered concern. "Sarah, that's horrible, absolutely dreadful." what has that got to do with me or this meeting? I was getting to that, Sarah said, her gaze unwavering. She opened her file. You see, Karen, I have evidence. Evidence that suggests you were involved. She held up the first photograph, Leo's bruised and welted foot, a collective intake of breath. These are the injuries my son sustained. Then a photo of the traps inside the shoes. And this is what caused them. She paused, letting the images sink in. As some of you know, my professional work is in juvenile injury prevention. I investigate cases of child endangerment and injury. So when my own son was targeted, I naturally conducted my own preliminary investigation. She then held up the still from her security camera. This, Karen, is you on my porch at approximately 7:18 a.m. on Tuesday morning, near where Leo's shoes were. Can you explain what you were doing there? Karen stammered, I was dropping off an HOA newsletter. Yes, that was it. You weren't home. Odd, Sarah said, her voice cool, because the newsletters are delivered by mail, and you personally handed me mine the previous evening at my door. And you weren't carrying any newsletters in this footage, Karen. She then presented Mr. Henderson's signed statement about Karen purchasing a 4-pack of Victor mousetraps. Mr. Henderson, would you confirm you sold these traps to Ms. Kessler? Mr. Henderson, looking flustered but resolute, nodded. Yes, I did. Pack of 4 she bought. 2 were in my son's shoes, Karen. Sarah pressed. What happened to the other 2? Are they perhaps still in your garden shed or maybe your garage? Karen was visibly trembling now, her face ashen. This is outrageous slander. You have no proof I did anything. I also have a statement from Mrs. Albright, who saw you acting suspiciously near my house that morning, carrying a small paper bag similar to the one Mr. Henderson uses. Sarah continued, her voice ringing with conviction. And I have a full medical report detailing the extent of Leo's injuries and classifying this as an intentional act. She looked around at the stunned faces of her neighbors. This wasn't a prank. This was a calculated attempt to harm a disabled child, my son, because he was seen as different, as an inconvenience, as someone who didn't fit into someone else's narrow vision of what this community should be. Her voice rose, filled with the righteous anger she had suppressed for days. And the person responsible for that vision, the person who has consistently tried to make my son feel unwelcome, the person who bought those traps and was seen on my porch, is you, Karen Kessler. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked trapped, exposed. At that moment, as if on cue, 2 uniformed police officers entered the clubhouse. Sarah had indeed alerted them, requesting they arrive discreetly towards the end of the meeting, ready to act, depending on how events unfolded. Detective Miller, the officer who had taken her initial report, stepped forward. Karen Kessler. Detective Miller said, his voice calm but firm. We'd like to ask you some questions down at the station regarding an incident involving Leo Vance. It seems there's compelling evidence suggesting your involvement in causing injury to a minor. Karen stared at the officers, then at Sarah, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning terror. The confident HOA president persona crumbled, revealing a frightened, desperate woman. No, this is a mistake. She's lying. It's a misunderstanding, she shrieked, as one of the officers gently took her arm. The room was silent, save for Karen's panicked protests as she was escorted out. The residents looked at Sarah, their expressions a mixture of shock, sympathy, and dawning respect. The climax had been swift, brutal, and very, very public. Karen's reign of petty tyranny was over. In the days that followed, the full weight of the legal system descended upon Karen Kessler. The police executed a search warrant on her house and found the remaining 2 mousetraps still in their packaging in her garage, along with the sun hat and sunglasses from Sarah's security footage. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy trial, Karen's defiance evaporated. The HOA board immediately moved to strip her of her presidency and membership, issuing a public apology to Sarah and Leo. The community, galvanized by the shocking events, rallied around them. People stopped by with gifts, for Leo offered words of support to Sarah and expressed their shame and outrage at Karen's actions. Willow Creek Estates, once a place of simmering resentments and unspoken prejudices under Karen's rule, began to feel like a genuine community for the first time. Karen Kessler was charged with multiple offenses, including aggravated assault on a minor child endangerment and intentional infliction of injury upon a disabled individual, which carried enhanced penalties. Sarah, though relieved, found the legal process draining. She had to give testimony reliving the trauma. Leo, too, had to speak to child advocacy professionals, a difficult experience for him, but he did so with a quiet bravery that made Sarah immensely proud. Karen's defense attorney tried to portray her as a stressed, lonely woman who had snapped under pressure, claiming she never intended serious harm, that it was a misguided attempt to scare Sarah into being more compliant with HOA rules. But the evidence of premeditation, the purchase of the traps, the stealthy approach to Sarah's home, the deliberate placement in a disabled child's orthopedic shoes, was undeniable. The judge was not swayed by the defense's portrayal. "Ms. Kessler," he said during sentencing, his voice stern, "your actions were not merely misguided. They were malicious, cruel, and cowardly. You targeted a vulnerable child, exploiting his disability in an attempt to terrorize him and his mother. You abused your position of trust within your community. This court finds your conduct reprehensible." Karen Kessler was sentenced to several years in prison, followed by a lengthy probation period. She was also ordered to pay restitution for Leo's medical expenses and therapy, and a restraining order was put in place prohibiting her from ever contacting Sarah or Leo again or coming within a significant distance of their home should she ever return to the area. Her house in Willow Creek was eventually sold to cover legal fees and fines, its pristine facade no longer hiding the ugliness within. For Sarah and Leo, life began to heal. Leo gradually regained his confidence. He started playing outside again, his laughter once more echoing in their backyard. The community embraced him. Children sought him out to play their parents, now more aware and inclusive. The HOA, under new, more compassionate leadership, even worked with Sarah to install a small, accessible playground in the common green space, a project Karen had vehemently opposed for years. It became known as Leo's Park. Sarah, for her part, found a new sense of purpose. She continued her work as a Juvenile Injury Prevention Officer with renewed passion, sharing Leo's story with his permission, and names changed in training seminars to highlight the dangers of insidious prejudice and the importance of protecting vulnerable children. She advocated for stronger community safeguards and better education on disability awareness. One sunny afternoon, months later, Sarah watched Leo playing in Leo's Park. He was on the swing, his legs pumping, his face alight with pure, unadulterated joy. The orthopedic shoes, a new pair, were sturdy and supportive. The scars on his foot had faded, and more importantly, the shadows in his eyes were gone. Mrs. Albright sat beside Sarah on the park bench. "He's a strong boy, your Leo," she said softly. "And you're a strong mother." Sarah smiled a genuine, peaceful smile. "We both are," she agreed. The ordeal had tested them, scarred them, but it hadn't broken them. It had, in its own terrible way, forged something stronger, a more resilient child, a more determined mother, and a community that had finally learned the true meaning of looking out for one another. The drama had ended, leaving behind not just the bitter taste of justice served, but the sweet, enduring resonance of courage, healing, and hope. The echoes of Karen's cruelty would eventually fade entirely, but the sound of Leo's laughter in the park, named after him, would be a lasting testament to their victory.